What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
You know how some families pretend everything is equal, how they act like they treat all their kids the same, and if you ever question it, they'll roll their eyes and accuse you of being dramatic? That's exactly how mine operates, except in our case, there's no pretending for me anymore, because I've had more than enough evidence stacked up over the years to see the pattern for what it is. My younger brother Ryan could sneeze in the right direction, and my parents would throw him a celebration, while I could work 2 jobs, ace my classes, and still somehow end up being told I should do more, or be grateful. For the longest time, I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was just being sensitive, that maybe it wasn't about favoritism, but about timing or circumstances. But when you start lining up every little incident over the years, the picture becomes too clear to ignore, and it's not a flattering one for them. When Ryan turned 16, they bought him a car, a nice one too, with a bow on top, while making a big speech about how it's important for a young man to be independent, and it will help him focus on school. Meanwhile, I had been taking the bus for years, sometimes walking home in the rain, and when I hinted that maybe they could help me out with transportation too, they said something about how I was managing just fine and didn't need extra expenses right now. That was the tone of every difference between us. His needs were urgent, mine were optional. They paid for his sports trips across the country without blinking, but when my debate team qualified for nationals, I had to scrape together the money myself by working extra shifts at the cafe, and when I asked for help, they suggested maybe it wasn't worth going if I couldn't afford it. I still went, still placed, still came home proud, but the only thing I got from them was a lukewarm, good job before they changed the subject to something Ryan had done that week. I kept swallowing it because I thought, fine, maybe this is just how it is, maybe if I keep my head down, work hard, and avoid rocking the boat, I'll eventually earn the same respect and support. I tried to believe that. But the final straw came on a random Tuesday night over dinner, when my mom casually dropped a sentence that changed everything. She said, "We're taking Ryan to tour colleges across Europe next month. We'll be gone for 2 weeks. You'll figure something out for yourself." She said it like she was telling me to pick up milk on the way home, as if there was nothing about that sentence that might sting, as if the idea that I might want the same opportunity didn't even occur to her. I asked, and I already knew the answer, whether they had considered helping me visit schools when I was applying. My dad barely looked up from his plate and said, "You didn't need it. You're independent. You've always been good at figuring things out." Something in me just clicked. It wasn't sadness or even anger anymore. It was this calm, cold clarity that they were never going to change, no matter how hard I worked or how much I tried to be understanding. They had already decided where I ranked in their little family hierarchy, and I was done trying to climb higher in a system they controlled. That night, lying in bed, I realized I didn't want to keep fighting for scraps of attention or support. I didn't want to wait around for another dinner where they'd casually announce the next big thing they were doing for Ryan while expecting me to clap politely from the sidelines. And I certainly didn't want to still be here when they came back from their European parade, smiling over cappuccinos and pastries while expecting me to nod and act happy for them. It wasn't just about being left out of the trip. It was about every single moment leading up to it, the years of being told to figure it out myself, the subtle digs about how I was fine without help, the way Ryan's smallest efforts were rewarded like major achievements, while mine were brushed aside. If they wanted me to figure things out on my own, then fine, I would. Just not in the way they thought. I wasn't going to throw a tantrum, I wasn't going to beg, and I wasn't going to try to guilt them into changing their plans. Instead, I was going to make sure that when they left, they'd come back to a version of reality they didn't even think was possible. I remember looking around my room that night and thinking, this space isn't mine anymore, this house isn't mine, and, honestly, this family isn't mine either. I had been keeping myself small here for so long, making sure not to upset anyone, believing that maybe one day it would pay off. But if they wanted me to be the one who figures it out, then I was going to do exactly that, only I wasn't going to tell them how, and I wasn't going to let them see it coming. So I smiled through the next few weeks, listened to their travel plans, laughed when they made jokes about me holding down the fort while they were gone, and acted like it didn't bother me. They thought I was sulking in silence, just biding my time until they came back and everything went back to normal. What they didn't know, and what they would never forget once they found out, was that by the time their plane touched down, I wouldn't be here waiting for them. In fact, I wouldn't be here at all. Once I had made up my mind that I was not going to sit in that house waiting for them to come back from their grand tour of Europe, the entire way I looked at my life shifted, because suddenly I wasn't just existing in their world on their terms anymore. I was quietly building an exit that would be so complete and so deliberate they wouldn't be able to spin it into one of their family stories where I'm the stubborn but harmless daughter who always lands on her feet. The truth was, they had no idea what I was capable of when I stopped caring about their approval, and I wasn't about to give them a preview. I started with something they'd never see as suspicious: being agreeable. I laughed at their jokes about me keeping an eye on the place while they were gone. I nodded when they gave me their long list of things they thought I should handle in their absence, and I even offered to take on a few more responsibilities, which they found amusing because in their minds, I was too busy with my little job to really help. That was the thing. They had such a fixed idea of who I was that they couldn't imagine I had the time, the skill, or the motivation to do anything significant without them knowing. I leaned into that because the more they underestimated me, the more freedom I had to move without them asking questions. The first real step was tied to something I had been quietly involved with for years, but never really claimed as my own: their small rental property business. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't huge, but it was steady money for them, and I had been helping manage it since I was a teenager, handling tenant calls when they were too busy, processing payments online, scheduling repairs, even drafting up renewal agreements. They had always treated it like busy work they were throwing me to keep me productive, but I knew the system better than either of them. I knew the passwords, the bank links, the lease terms, the late payment policies, and which tenants could be trusted to handle things quickly versus which ones needed more follow-up. While they were making hotel bookings and talking about train routes between Paris and Rome, I was making a different kind of plan. I went into the property management portal and confirmed I still had full administrative access. Of course I did, because why would they bother changing anything for the helper daughter, who supposedly couldn't manage anything important? I checked the tenant contact list and started updating my own separate file with all their phone numbers, email addresses, and lease dates. I made copies of the property keys, not because I planned to use them for anything shady, but because I wanted to make sure that when I was gone, I could hand over everything to someone I trusted without needing to ask my parents for access. I knew that if I just walked away without setting things up properly, they'd be able to spin it into me being irresponsible or abandoning my duties, and I wasn't going to give them that narrative. My plan wasn't just to leave, it was to leave in a way that meant I still held a card they couldn't play without me. So I started reaching out to a couple of people I knew through work who had experience in property management. I didn't tell them the whole story, I just said I was considering stepping away from helping my family and wondered if they knew anyone trustworthy who could take over my part of the job. I wanted someone who would report to me, not to my parents, because the entire point was to quietly remove their control while keeping things running smoothly enough that they couldn't claim I'd caused chaos. All of this was done in small, careful moves, because the last thing I wanted was for them to suspect anything before they left. I kept my tone casual when I asked questions about upcoming lease renewals. I acted like I was just getting organized when I went through their filing cabinet for copies of contracts, and I even made sure to bring up how overwhelming. It all was in a joking way so they'd assume I was venting, not strategizing. Every detail I collected, every file I duplicated, every password I confirmed, it was another layer of insulation between me and whatever mess they'd try to pull once they realized I wasn't going to be their unpaid assistant anymore. The satisfaction of it was subtle at first, just a quiet knowledge that for the first time in a long time, I was making moves that weren't about pleasing them or earning scraps of recognition. But as the days went on, I started to feel a shift inside me. I wasn't just reacting to their treatment anymore, I was shaping my own next chapter without asking for permission, and it felt powerful in a way that didn't need to be loud or dramatic. I could play the part of the cooperative daughter all the way until they walked out the door for their trip, but beneath that surface, I was already positioning myself somewhere they wouldn't be able to reach. By the time they left for their little European adventure, suitcases in hand and smiles on their faces, I had more than just the physical keys to their properties. I had every piece of information, every point of contact, and every bit of operational control that actually kept their little business alive. They thought they were going to spend 2 weeks sipping wine and touring historic campuses while I sat at home, maybe feeling a little left out, but ultimately just carrying on as usual. They didn't realize that by the time they boarded their return flight, the foundation of their comfortable setup would already belong to me, and that I had no intention of handing it back. The funny thing about being the kid who is told to figure it out is that you eventually do, and when you do, you build muscles no one in your family notices until those muscles start moving things they thought were bolted to the floor. Which is exactly what happened once they were in the air, and I finally let myself act without the usual hesitation that comes from wondering whether I should warn them, because I had warned them for years in 100 small ways, and they had never listened. So, this time I simply moved. I started with work because work had always been mine, the one area they could not belittle with the kind of comments that sound supportive until you sit with them for a minute and realize they are meant to keep you in your place. So I called a friend from the office who had moved to another state last year for a role that came with on-site housing, and I asked her to be blunt about whether her company was still hiring, whether the housing was real and not one of those offers that takes months to materialize, and whether she would put her name on me if I applied quickly and kept my head down for the first few months while I established myself. She laughed, not unkindly, and said she had been waiting for me to ask, that she knew I would eventually get tired of being the family assistant with a real resume, and within a day she sent me a formal referral, a list of interview times, and a note from her manager saying that if my references checked out and I could start within a month, the apartment key would be waiting at the front desk. I did the practical things first, because the practical things are what people who value control forget to do when they panic, and I didn't intend to panic, so I moved my savings out of the family emergency account my parents had insisted on keeping years ago under the pretense that it would help all of us, which in practice meant it helped Ryan when he overspent and me when I asked permission, so I stopped asking and I closed it. And I opened a new account under my own name with alerts set to my phone and duplications to an email they did not know existed. I updated my direct deposit details at work. I changed the recovery email on every platform tied to the rental business, and I created a clean paper trail for every step, not because I planned to use it against them, but because I knew they would accuse me of being impulsive or sneaky, and I wanted to be able to say, calmly and without drama, that I had followed the rules they always told me to follow, just not the ones that kept me small. Then I did the part that made me feel the most like I was finally stepping into my own life. I called the tenants, one by one, and I told them that while my parents were away, I would be their point of contact for rent, maintenance, and renewals, which was not new in practice, but was new in tone, because I spoke like the person who actually ran the system rather than the daughter relaying messages, and they responded to that immediately, probably because they had been dealing with me for years, and knew I answered quickly and solved problems without speeches. I verified everyone's preferred payment method, I standardized due date reminders so no one could claim confusion, and I set up a separate mailbox for maintenance requests that forwarded to a property manager I had pre-vetted through my friend's network. A woman named Nora who had no patience for chaos and even less for parents who pretended they were hands-on while dumping the real work on their kid. I gave Nora a simple instruction: keep the buildings running, keep receipts for everything, and route all decisions above a small dollar amount through me. In return, she would get prompt payment and zero theatrics. She said she liked my style and that if my parents tried to meddle later, she would deal with them courteously while taking direction from the person who actually signed her invoice, which would be me. While I was building that structure, I kept my day job steady, because leaving with a plan requires more than emotion, and I needed the offer letter in hand before I packed a single box, so I did the interviews in my lunch breaks, gave straightforward answers without overselling myself, and kept the focus on what I could deliver in the first 90 days, not on the drama at home. By the end of the week, they sent a formal offer with a start date aligned to the end of the month and a line stating, That corporate housing would be provided for the first year, after which I could either renew or take a housing allowance. And I read that line 3 times because it was the first time in a long time I had seen a path that did not rely on my parents' mood or generosity. I signed. I confirmed my move-in date with the building, and I booked a one-way ticket for the morning before my parents were due to land, which felt tidy and almost impersonal, the way closing a chapter should feel when you have turned every page carefully and nothing is left to discuss. I kept them updated on exactly nothing, which was out of character for me and therefore safer than pretending to be chatty, because the less I said, the more they filled in the gaps with their usual assumptions that I was staying put and waiting for them to return with stories and souvenirs. Instead, I was transferring utilities out of my name, separating my phone plan, and canceling a handful of subscriptions my mother had tacked onto the joint card because she liked the points, which I no longer intended to subsidize. I boxed my essentials at night and took them to a friend's spare room so the house would look unchanged if anyone peeked. I scanned every document I might need in the next year and stored it on a drive that would not be left behind. And I wrote a list of the last tasks to execute in the 48 hours before my flight, because precision calms nerves when the stakes are high and the audience is not on your side. There was one more move I debated for days, not because it was risky in a legal sense, but because I knew it would be interpreted as ungrateful no matter how I framed it. And that move was to redirect the rent deposits to the new operating account overseen by me and Nora rather than the mixed personal account my parents had always used, where property income and personal spending blurred into the same balance, which made taxes unnecessarily messy and accountability impossible. I justified the change to myself by remembering every time a repair had been delayed because someone did not want to cut into family cash flow, and I told myself that running a business like a business was not betrayal, it was adulthood, and if they wanted to prove me wrong, they could show me a clean ledger that did not exist. I sent the formal notice to tenants with the new account information and a clear effective date. I confirmed the first scheduled deposits with small test transfers, and I sat back in my chair and let the relief hit me, not because I had taken anything, but because I had finally stopped pretending that my labor and knowledge were family favors instead of real work. I did all of this while their group messages buzzed with photos from old buildings and captions about how inspiring it was to walk through places that had shaped great minds, which would have stung a year ago but now landed like background noise. Because I was no longer auditioning for their version of me, I was underwriting my own, and every small confirmation email, every forwarded receipt, every signed document felt like a piece of the ground locking into place under my feet. When Ryan sent a casual note asking if I could check on a package that he had delivered to the house, I answered politely and told him I would make sure it was there when they got back, and I meant it, because I was not here to be petty, I was here to be finished. By the end of the second week, the system was live, the tenants were paying into the new account, Nora was handling maintenance without a hiccup, my offer letter was signed, my move-in time was scheduled, and my belongings were already out of sight, which meant that all that remained was the exit itself and the one message I would leave behind on the kitchen counter, not as a dramatic goodbye, but as a reminder that I had done exactly what they taught me to do, which was figure it out. And yet, as I set my alarm for the flight and checked my list one final time, I smiled at the part they would not grasp until it cost them a night of sleep. I was not just leaving the house. I was leaving with the only blueprint that kept their so-called business from collapsing the second someone asked a real question, and the person who would be answering those questions from now on would not be them. There is a particular kind of calm that shows up when you stop asking whether your plan will be approved and start focusing on whether your plan is complete, and that is exactly what I felt in the 48 hours before my flight. Because every box that mattered had already moved, every account that could be separated already was, every tenant who needed reassurance had it in writing, and every service vendor who used to wait on my parents' scattered replies now had a single point of contact, with clear payment terms and a response window, which meant that leaving was not a jump into chaos so much as a quiet handoff from my old life to my new one, and I intended to make that handoff so boring on the surface that no one could accuse me of making a scene. I finished the last round of confirmations with Nora, who sent me a tidy spreadsheet that would have made any auditor smile, and I told her that if my parents called while they were still abroad, she should keep it courteous and brief. Refer to the standing work orders and remind them that invoices would be paid from the operating account on the same schedule every month, because consistency is a language even stubborn people understand when money is involved. At home, I kept up the performance out of habit, though there was no one to fool anymore, and I wiped down counters, returned the set of tools to the hall closet, and folded the spare linens as if I were preparing for guests. Not because they deserved a tidy exit, but because I wanted to walk out without a single thing left hanging over me, without a single argument available to them that I had been reckless or vindictive or dramatic. Since nothing unsettles people who rely on volatility more than impeccable order. I left on the dresser 2 envelopes, one thin and one thick, the thin one addressed to my parents in my neat handwriting with a simple line inside that said they had told me to figure it out and I had, that I was safe and settled, that all property communications would now be handled by the licensed manager listed below, and that I wished them a smooth transition. The thick envelope was for me if I ever doubted myself, copies of the signed offer letter, the housing agreement, the vendor contracts, and the new account details, a physical reminder that this was not a tantrum or a disappearing act, it was adulthood with a paper trail. I took one last pass through the house to make sure nothing that belonged to me remained, not even a charger or a sweater, because I did not want a reason for them to say I had to come back. And then I placed a small item that did not matter to anyone but me at the back of a cabinet, a habit from childhood, something I used to do when I wanted to know whether someone had been snooping. And even now I knew that when they eventually found it, they would call to tell me with that tone that pretends to be amused, but is actually accusatory. And I would be able to say that no, I did not forget anything. I simply left a marker to measure how long it took them to start digging through the past instead of dealing with the present. I scheduled one more thing before I slept, an email that would go out around the time their plane was due to land. A professional note from Nora's address copied to a dedicated mailbox, outlining the current status of the properties, reminding them of the new payment processing, attaching the maintenance logs for the month, and enclosing a straightforward management agreement that formalized what had been happening in practice for years, which was that the person who kept their units full and their tenants calm and their vendors paid was not a faceless family helper, but an actual manager, and that going forward the system would continue without interruptions as long as the agreement was acknowledged and the operating account remained in place. On the morning of my flight, I left the keys on the hook by the door because I had already ensured that the only keys that mattered were digital and those were no longer in their pockets, and I carried my bag to the rideshare with a lightness I did not expect. Not the giddy kind that fades when reality hits, but the steady kind that arrives when you are doing the thing you said you would do and there is no one left to convince. In the airport, I did not check my messages, not because I was afraid of what I would see, but because I had built the day so that nothing they said could change the outcome. And I boarded with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been overlooked long enough to travel late. When I landed and picked up the key from the building's desk, the clerk handed me a small welcome packet with access codes and a map of the laundry room and a list of nearby grocery stores, and none of those things are remarkable enough to mention except that they were mine, not borrowed. Under a condition, not offered with a side of commentary about the proper way to be grateful, just mine. And I put that packet on the kitchen counter of a place that would be home for the first year, and I stood there in the silence that belongs to you when you have paid for it with your own work. Then, because I am not cruel and because I understand that even people who refuse to hear you still deserve clarity, I turned my phone back on and watched the messages pour in, the early ones bubbly and braggy from their trip, the middle ones routine. The later ones tinged with confusion when the tenants started replying to my scheduled notices and not to them, and finally the frantic wave that arrived as Nora's email hit and the portal access they had never bothered to learn now required authorization they no longer held. My mother left a voicemail that was half scolding and half pleading, insisting that I come home to straighten out the mess I created, which made me laugh out loud because the only mess present was the one where they had mistaken control for confidence and now had neither. and my father sent a short line asking how to log in, which told me everything I needed to know about who had actually been paying attention all these years. I did not reply, not yet, because there was nothing to discuss until they read the agreement like adults and decided whether they preferred stability or ego, and regardless of their choice I would still be here, with my new key and my own mailbox and a calendar that did not revolve around their plans. For good measure, and because emotional justice sometimes looks like administrative hygiene, I filed a simple request with the bank to remove my name from the old shared card and closed the last lingering utility in my profile. And I forwarded the insurance renewal notice to Nora so she could coordinate it properly, because if they wanted to tell people I ran off to punish them, those people would learn quickly that the person who left also left them covered in ways they never were when the money moved through the kitchen drawer. I made myself a basic dinner, opened the laptop, and typed a short message that would go out in the morning to my parents from my own address rather than the family thread, stating that I was safe, that I had moved for work, that the properties were professionally managed, and that any transition questions should be directed to the manager whose contact information was at the bottom of the page, and then I added one last line that I knew would stick the way. Truth does when it is undeniable. You told me for years to figure it out myself, and I finally did, which means I will not be flying back to fix what only you can choose to fix. When I closed the laptop and set the alarm, I felt that same calm settle again, and I knew the next time my phone buzzed it would be the sound of consequences arriving in a house that had always assumed I would absorb them, which I would not do anymore. And as I turned off the light, I realized that the best part of this whole plan was not the leverage or the order or the exit. It was the exact moment they would walk through their front door, see the counter, and read a note that said nothing dramatic at all, just a single sentence that told the truth they had taught me and did not expect to hear back. I figured it out, and I am gone. By the time their plane landed and the first wave of messages hit my phone with that wild mix of confusion and indignation that always shows up when people who never read instructions discover there are instructions, I had already slept a full night in my new place. I had already met the building manager who handed me a spare fob like this was the most normal thing in the world, and I had already had a cup of coffee while watching Nora's scheduled status email go out with attachments so clean a banker could frame them. Which is why when my mother's voice cracked in a voicemail telling me I had blindsided the family, and my father sent a question mark followed by a demand for the portal password and Ryan texted me a single line asking if I was mad for real or just being dramatic, I let the phone sit there on the counter and I let the silence do the work for once, because I was finished performing availability for people who never offered it back. I answered exactly one message, not because they deserved it, but because clarity is the only language that survives a family like mine, so I wrote a short note that said I was safe, that I had moved for work, that the properties were operational under professional management, and that any questions should be directed to the manager whose contact information was at the bottom. And then I added one more sentence that I knew would change the shape of the conversation forever, which was that I was willing to do a single call to outline the path forward if they could manage to show up on time with a notepad instead of a speech. They accepted within minutes, which told me panic was doing what empathy never managed to do. On the call, I kept my voice level and my sentences long enough to make interruptions awkward, and I started by laying out facts, because facts cut through theatrics, and I explained that the tenants were current. The deposits were routing to the operating account held for the properties. The maintenance backlog had been cleared. The insurance renewal was in process. And the only thing missing from their comfortable picture was me playing translator between their habits and reality, which I would no longer do without terms that reflected the truth of the work. My mother launched into the old song about family and loyalty and how she wished I had come to them woman to woman, and my father said he would have appreciated a heads up. And I let both lines pass like traffic because nostalgia is not a plan and courtesy has never paid a vendor. Then I gave them the offer that would either fix their problem or expose it, and I did it in simple pieces so there could be no debate about what I meant, and I said that option 1 was to sign Nora's management agreement for 1 full year with no interference, after which they could take their keys back beautifully if they wanted, because by then they would have learned the systems or they would have learned to respect the people who did. Option 2 was to sell 1 unit to pay off the tax mess. and the deferred maintenance they never wanted to admit existed, which would put their remaining places on solid footing under Nora with less strain, and I would step away completely after a short handover. Option 3. And I did not smile when I said it, even though I wanted to, was to keep pretending I had done something wrong and try to wrestle control back without a plan, in which case vendors would stop extending grace, tenants would stop waiting on vague promises, and the next conversation they had would be with a city inspector who does not care about family dynamics. They both went quiet in the way people do when the game they always win is not on the table anymore, and after a beat my father asked why the deposits were not going to the old account, and I told him that the old account mixed rent with grocery runs and flights and holiday gifts, which made compliance a joke, and that a proper operating account protected their asset, their tenants, and their sleep. And if they wanted their sleep back, they could sign what had been sent to them before the call. My mother asked if I was doing this to punish them for the trip, and I said I was doing it because I believed in learning the lesson you teach, and they had taught me to figure things out myself, which I had. And the only difference this time was that figuring it out did not make me small. Then I did the part that made this not just an exit but a win, and I laid out my terms, and I said I would waive any claim to back pay for the years I ran the show if they signed the management agreement and a short addendum that acknowledged, in writing, that I had acted in the best interest of the properties and had authority to make operational decisions through the transition, because I was not interested in dragging us into court or into holidays where people rehearse grievances like monologues. I was interested in clean endings and clean beginnings. I also said that if they wanted my occasional advice over the next year, they could have it by email with a reasonable consulting fee and a 24-hour response window. Otherwise, all requests should go to Nora, who would be happy to help as long as they treated her like the professional she is. Ryan finally spoke and asked if this meant I was never coming home again, and I told him I had a home and a job and a lease and a life that were not built around making anyone else look confident, and that he would be fine if he learned how to read his own forms. And if he wanted a head start, I'd send him a simple budget template and the contact for the campus advisor who had helped me years ago when I was told to figure it out alone, which he could either use or ignore, but I would not be writing his emails for him anymore. There was a long silence that for once did not scare me, and then my father said he would sign, and my mother said she would think about the tone, and I told them the tone was the sound of boundaries, which always feels rude when you have never had to respect one. They signed the next morning, and Nora confirmed receipt with the kind of dry cheer that tells you a storm has passed, and I set a filter on my inbox so that anything from the old family threads skipped my phone and landed in a folder I would check when I felt like it. Not when they felt like drafting me, and I went to work on time and kept my head down and sent my first rent roll to the accountant on schedule, because revenge that changes nothing is just theater, and I was not here for theater. I was here for results. Weeks later, my mother sent a message with an apology that did not fix history but acknowledged a piece of it, and my father forwarded a screenshot of the first month closing smoothly. And Ryan texted me a photo of a planner with a joke about finally being the responsible one, and I did not reply to any of it right away because I was at dinner with people who know me as the person I actually am. If you are waiting for me to say I forgave everyone in a burst of generosity, I won't, because forgiveness is not a switch, and it is not a performance either. It is a long practice of not letting old patterns win the new day, and I am practicing, which is enough. What matters is that when they came back from their tour and tried to put me back in my role, they found a different stage entirely, one where I had set the lights and the cues and the exits, and the final move was not a slam of a door but a signed agreement. A steady ledger, and a life that does not blink when someone else needs a favor. I won without breaking myself to do it, and if there are still unanswered questions in the corners, they can stay there, because the core is settled, the tables are turned, and the lesson is finally clear even to the people who refused to hear it for years. You told me to figure it out, and I did, and once you learn how to do that, you do not go back.